The most brutal and infamous king of England was Henry VIII, who would, throughout his reign over his nation, sentence two of his wives to execution within the walls of the Tower of London. However, Henry VIII himself was a man who was known for his nasty streak, and he would even condemn some of his closest friends, including Thomas Cromwell. But his death was one which was in contrast to his chaotic life. He passed away peacefully inside of the Palace of Whitehall. However, when his burial vault was broken into, it was discovered that his coffin was badly damaged, but they could not work out how this happened. There were a different number of accounts about Henry VIII's body exploding and causing a significant amount of damage to his coffin, however. Henry VIII, on the 28th of January 1547, died at the Palace of Whitehall at the age of 55. His reign may have been one that was marred with chaos and brutality, but his final moments were serene, quiet, and he was surrounded by his closest household staff. On the day before his death, he saw his confessor and priest and was given Holy Communion, and it's likely that he feared for his soul and feared he would be sent to hell for the executions that he had ordered. Just a matter of days before, he had ordered his final execution, but those who attended on Henry VIII and visited him knew that he would be dead soon. The royal doctors were hesitant to tell him that he was dying, as this technically would be treason, and they worried about their heads. They were concerned Henry would order one final execution of his doctor for predicting his death whilst on his deathbed, but they knew their king and refused to tell him what was happening. The man who told the king he was in the clutches of death was Sir Anthony Denny, the well-liked attendant of the king, and the day before his death he said to Henry, "In man's judgment you are not like to live, and that the king should remember his sins as every good Christian man should do." Henry seemingly accepted his fate and said, "The mercy of Christ is able to pardon me all my sins, yes, though they were greater than they be." It's believed that the king accepted this, and on his deathbed he realised he had committed a large amount of wrong and sins during his time as the king. He was someone who had executed his wives, close friends, and many innocent people. Because of this, many people, including his wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, are considered victims of the Tudor monarch. Anne Boleyn, for example, would be accused of treason, adultery, and even incest, as the king needed a reason to be able to get rid of his second wife, and this saw her lose her head on the insides of the Tower of London. Thomas Cromwell, his close friend, as a fearsome man. However, Henry would listen to his advisers who hated Cromwell, and he too then lost his head on Tower Hill. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was then summoned to hear the final wishes of the king and to pray for him. His friend Anthony Denny was summoned to get the archbishop, and Henry then went into a deep sleep. Cranmer took hours to reach the king's side because of the icy conditions, and he arrived at midnight on the 28th of January. He then went to the king's side, but Henry was in the final moments of his life. He was struggling to stay awake and was drifting in and out of consciousness, and it was said that at the end there was no master and servant, no prince and churchman, just a priest preparing a departing soul for eternity. Cranmer begged Henry to give a sign that he trusted Christ for salvation, and in response he felt a grip on his hand tighten slightly. It was an evangelical departure, no anointing, no reading of Latin prayers, just a simple acknowledgement of the all-sufficient atoning work of Christ. Cranmer would have been glad of that. At 2 a.m, Henry VIII died. It's not known exactly what killed him, but for 2 days his body then stayed in the chamber undisturbed, and his death was kept quiet. After the king's death, his body was embalmed inside of his chambers, and this traditionally meant that the body, as a member of the royal family, was cut open and then had the internal organs removed. This was done to stave off decay, and the internal organs were then buried away from the body. This included the heart, intestines, and liver, alongside other parts, but this happened to King Henry VIII. It's not known for certain where these internal organs were buried of King Henry. However, the embalming process was key to keeping the king's remains in good condition, but this didn't happen. The embalming was done by professionals and by doctors, and it was done as there was a danger about gases in the body building up. But this led to one of the most shocking stories regarding Henry VIII's burial and body. There were reports that during the funeral procession, the ceremonial procession was so large that roads had to be widened to allow it to pass towards Windsor Castle, where Henry VIII would be buried inside of St George's Chapel. Inside of the large oak coffin was Henry's ever-rested body, and the cavity had been filled with herbs and spices and various other ointments that the body had been washed in. However, the coffin then rested at Sion Abbey for the evening, and because of this the coffin containing Henry VIII's body was left. But during the night there was allegedly an explosion inside of the coffin, and because of this the wood splintered, and it was said that some liquids came out of the king's huge wooden coffin. It was then alluded to that dogs may have even licked at this. However, this explosion did damage the coffin, and there were no reports of the coffin being fixed. The internal structure would have been damaged too, including the lead lining, which aimed to protect Henry's body as long as possible. The king was then buried inside of a small burial vault inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor. He was buried with Jane Seymour, his third wife. However, Henry VIII's vault was opened a number of times, and it was said that his coffin was in a poor state. He was also interred in the same vault that Charles I was later buried in, and because it was very small when Charles was placed in the vault, the builders and staff had to attempt to move the coffin of Henry VIII, which was said to have been great in its large size. It was then noted that the trestle that the coffin was sat on was broken, and this may have been done by the builders when Charles I was buried. And when the coffin was broken, and because of the sheer weight of Henry's coffin, this may have caused it. Also, it was noted that the outer shell of the wooden coffin of Henry VIII was broken and cracked open, and someone could peer inside and look at the remains of the former Tudor king. At one point, someone even tried to steal one of the bones of King Henry VIII. It was said of this that the sexton did his best to clear the chapel. Nevertheless, Isaac, the sexton's man, said that a foot soldier had hid himself so as he was not discerned, and being greedy of prey, crept into the vault and cut so much of the velvet pall that covered the great body, as he judged would hardly be missed, and wimpled also a hole through the said coffin that was largest, probably fancying that there was something well worth his adventure. The section of his opening the door epsied the sacrilegious person, who being searched, a bone was found about him, and with which he said he would have a knife. The governor being therefore informed of, he gave him his reward, and the lords and others present weren't convinced that a real body was in the great coffin, which some before had scrupled. What this means is that the coffin of King Henry VIII, which was referred to as a great coffin, had holes inside of it, and that the foot soldier in question broke into the burial vault of the former Tudor king, and then made his own hole in the ruined, decaying coffin. But then he reached into it and stole one of the bones of the notorious Tudor monarch. But this man then wanted to craft a knife handle with this, but the theft was quickly discovered, and the bone was then put back inside of the coffin. However, the hole was not prepared. The coffin and the vault of Henry VIII was opened a number of times following, but the last time was in the 19th century. The vault of Henry VIII was explored by Sir Henry Halford, and he looked at the body of Henry VIII through the holes in the coffin, but he was more concerned with the coffin next to the large one, as he was more bothered about Charles I's remains and locating them, as they had at this point been lost to time. But the damage to King Henry VIII's coffin may still be there, and there are no accounts that ever say that the coffin had been repaired, meaning that the king's remains may still be on display because of the damage. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.